So this is our last couple of sets of slides. We're going to talk about life in the ocean. There will be two videos on this and two sets of slides. This first set, we're going to talk about where things live and the plankton, and then we'll focus on the photosynthesizers. So let's talk about where things live. In the ocean, there are three options. The plankton and the nekton live up in the water. The difference is the plankton move with the current. They're basically organisms that float, although some of them are swimmers, they just can't swim against the current. Usually what they do is they will swim or move up into a current that will take them where they want to go. The nektana, however, are the swimmers. So these are things like fish, whales, dolphins, squid that can swim and move against the current. The nektana are strictly consumers. The plankton include things that photosynthesize as well as things that are consumers. And then we have the third category, which are the things that live on the bottom. So the benthonic creatures are things that either live on the bottom or attached to the bottom, or actually dig down into the bottom and live inside in the floor of the ocean. Some of them are permanently attached. Some of them are motile, which means that they can move around. And the benthonic creatures include producers, which are photosynthesizers generally, and consumers as well. So if we want to look at the plankton are these tiny little creatures that live in the ocean. And most of them are tiny, I should say. If you think about it, jellyfish are not tiny. We wouldn't be collecting jellyfish in a plankton net, at least not on purpose. But the plankton net is designed to collect microscopic organisms so that we can actually see kind of what's living in the water. So this net would be dragged behind a boat, and then the tiny little creatures end up getting caught in the net bucket. What you catch is based on the size of the mesh in the fabric. The planktonic creatures are classified several different ways. They're classified by size, which is shown in the diagram on the right. Everything from the super tiny plankton, which include viruses, you can see down there at the very bottom, all the way up to the stuff on the top, the megaplankton, which includes some of the very large jellyfish. And you can see there are all kinds of organisms in between at various sizes. We can also classify them based on lifestyle. Are they producers? Generally speaking, these are going to be the phytoplankton, but they're also chemosynthesizers as well. But the phytoplankton are the photosynthetic organisms that drift with the current. And the zooplankton are the things that eat photosynthesizers and other organisms. So they are the animal-like plankton. And some of them would be classified as animals and others would not. We can also look at life cycle. It turns out that some plankton are always plankton. They always drift with the current. That would be the holoplankton. And then there are some organisms that are classified as meroplankton, and that means that part of their lifestyle, they are plankton, but the rest of their lifestyle, they may live on the bottom, or they may be nektonic and they may be big enough to and strong enough to swim around. So let's shift our focus here to primary productivity. So we've already talked about this in a couple weeks ago when we talked about factors that affect life in the ocean, but we're talking about primary productivity, or the producers, and our focus is going to be on the photosynthesizers, but we will mention a little bit the organisms that do chemosynthesis. And the importance of this category of organisms is that these are the organisms that feed the ocean. Every organism that lives in the ocean has to either produce its own food. Those are called producers or primary producers. They do that through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. And if you're not doing that, then you're a consumer. That means that you're eating either one of these photosynthesizers, or you are eating something that ate something else. So, for example, on land, cows eat plants and people eat cows. People and cows are both consumers. They're just consuming at different levels. And people can eat plants as well. So some consumers might eat at multiple levels in the system. So one of the things that oceanographers do is that they measure primary productivity. How productive is the ocean? And the way they do this is they measure it in grams of carbon bound per square meter of ocean surface. And if we go back to this little calculation here, you can see why they do that, because carbohydrates are being bound up in the process of productivity. And it's the carbohydrates that the consumers then eat. So the way you measure it is grams of carbon bound, and that's about 10% of the producer's mass gets bound up. There are different ways to sample it. One way is to put a series of suspended bottles. You hang them down in the water at different depths, and you can measure how much the productivity is at various levels in the water. You can also mimic ocean conditions in the lab and measure it that way. And then what we find is the breakdown. The phytoplankton are 90 to 98% of the productivity in the ocean. So most of the productivity in the ocean are single-celled organisms that are photosynthesizing. And the example they have in the image here is a little critter called a diatom. Seaweeds, the macroscopic organisms that you can see, and we're going to talk about algae and plants, are anywhere between 2 and 10% of the productivity in the ocean. And then the chemosynthesis, which we see primarily at the bottom near deep sea vents, that accounts for about 1% of the productivity in the ocean. And you can see the average productivity number is in the range of 75 to 150 grams of carbon per square meter per year. So what are the factors that limit this? Well, if you think about how, and we're going to focus on photosynthesis here, but if you think about growing plants on land, they need water. That's not an issue in the ocean. There's plenty of water. They need carbon dioxide. And if you remember back to our ocean chemistry chapter, carbon dioxide is very abundant in the ocean, so that's not an issue. So neither one of those are considered to be limiting factors. Nutrients, on the other hand, is a big limiting factor. Certain nutrients are needed by the photosynthesizers to do their job. And as long as those nutrients are limited, the activity of the producers is going to be limited as well. Those nutrients are typically replaced by runoff from rivers, upwelling, and we talked about ocean currents, and the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere in some places can concentrate this material. For example, if you're downwind from a desert. But generally, when you look at the ocean, where you see lots and lots of productivity or photosynthetic life, you're looking at a place that's either getting runoff from a river, a big river like the Mississippi, for example, can cause large blooms of productivity, or upwelling from the deep ocean. So if we look at a map of ocean currents, we can actually predict where there would be a lot of productivity. Light is the other limiting factor, and light is primarily related to depth. The deeper you go, the less light there is, and so we see most of the productivity near the surface. And it can also vary with things like the season and with other material that's in the ocean which could potentially block the water. So what we see is that the photosynthetic organisms really need to stay near the surface, when we look in a couple of minutes at the algae that live in the ocean, we'll find that some of the algae actually have these accessory pigments that help them absorb light and then pass that energy on to the chlorophyll. So as you would expect, the phytoplankton are most productive close to the surface. You'll notice that there's actually a depth, we call it the compensation depth, below which the energy that producer consumes at night, because remember they can only photosynthesize when it's light out, exceeds what they produce during the day. So if one of these phytoplankton or a photosynthesizer goes too deep, they basically starve overnight. So that's the compensation depth. Here's some diagrams from your book on global distribution of productivity. You can see continental shelves, tropics, polar. Each region has its own mix of conditions that can lead to increased or decreased productivity. And you can see that there are some important seasonal variations, especially when you get into the higher latitudes. So let's take a look at some of the producers that live in the ocean. The phytoplankton include dinoflagellates and diatoms. I love the diatoms. I think they look very cool. The other interesting thing about the diatoms is how small they are. Diatoms are small enough that if you were to drown, diatoms would pass through your lung tissue and end up in your bloodstream. Some of the diatoms live on the bottom, and there's a discussion in your book about their reproduction. They actually do kind of an interesting thing where very often they get big and then they split in half like you would expect a single-celled organism to do, but they're also able to reproduce sexually and mix their genes up with other diatoms of their species. Another phytoplankton is the Kaka Litha. These are really, really even tinier, maybe sometimes than the diatoms, or of a similar size. And you can see the outside of the Kaka Litha is covered with shells. The diatom has a shell as well. I should go back to that and point that out. So these are photosynthetic organisms that actually have shells. The plates left over when the Kaka Litha dies become chalk, which is a biogenous sediment. And last but not least, we'll talk about the true plants and the algae. The difference between the two, these are both large multicellular organisms, but the algae, it turns out, are actually independent single-celled critters that live together in a colony. They are not able to transport nutrients through vascular tissue, and that's the big difference between true plants and algae. Most of what you would call seaweeds or plants that you see in the water are actually algae, especially in the ocean. True plants have osmotic issues when they're in the ocean, and they also need a soft bottom in which to sink their roots. Algae do not have roots. They actually stick to the bottom, and so they need a solid bottom to hang on to. Some of the algae actually are free floating. Now the challenges for these large organisms, because they're near the surface, they're exposed to wave action and they're potentially exposed to the air and predators that live near the surface or near the coast. And so that's why many of these organisms are very slippery or slimy when you touch them, because it not only lubricates them as the water moves around them, but it retards drying and deters grazers. So we just have about 30 seconds left, and you can look these differences up in your book. Algae look like plants, but you'll notice they give them different names: blades, stipes, holdfasts, because there is no vascular tissue to transport material. And last but not least are the true plants, which are flowering plants. There are only a few species and they tend to live very close to the coast.